So first I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about who breastfeeds in the United States these days, and to put a question in your head about what breastfeeding really is these days. Is it what we think of when we think of the word breastfeeding anymore? And that will lead to some discussion about pumping human milk, or also called milk expression, and its downstream effects, or potential downstream effects, especially for infants. And then I'd like to pose the question of whether the evidence that we have about the benefits of breastfeeding generalize to today's women and infants anymore. Because this is largely an epidemiology group, I definitely want to make sure we talk a little bit about measurement challenges. And then a topic that is very common to any discussion about breastfeeding, and that is what can we really say about causality in terms of breastfeeding impact on various health outcomes. So first, what do we know about who breastfeeds in the United States these days? One piece of good news is that we have actually made major progress in the past couple of decades in our overall breastfeeding prevalence in the US. As of 2017, about 84% of US infants were ever breastfed, and Michigan is right on par with that, actually. And in fact, Michigan has made more significant progress than average for the rest of the country, in that in 2004, our national rate was about 74%, and Michigan was only 63%. So I don't know what you all are doing up there, but it's working pretty well. One area where we fall down a little bit here in the United States, and really seen, and there's a lot of focus right now on making more progress, is in terms of the proportion of infants who are exclusively breastfed to the 6-month mark. A lot of our breastfeeding recommendations are tied to this benchmark, and it's now about a quarter of infants, whereas before it was only actually 11% in 2004. And today, about a third of infants are still breastfeeding to some extent at 12 months of age, which is also represents a lot of significant progress. This was only 21% of infants back in 2004. So this is all some good news. We could always make more progress for certain, but it is an area where in public health we have made some progress. On the other hand, we do still have persistent disparities in pretty much across the board in these breastfeeding metrics by factors like race, ethnicity, income, education, and age. Just to summarize those disparities, between 73 and 77% of infants are ever breastfed who are born to either non-Hispanic Black mothers, mothers with less than a high school education, very young mothers, mothers outside metro areas, unmarried mothers, and mothers living at 100% of the poverty level for income. So we certainly have a lot more progress to make in closing these disparities, and a lot of intervention work these days is really focused on boosting rates in one or more of these high priority subgroups. Now, all of these national data were drawn from the CDC National Immunization Survey, which is usually considered our official source of breastfeeding statistics for the United States. Now, when you were thinking about those various statistics I was just mentioning, you probably had an idea or an image in your head of what breastfeeding is. Really thinking about what that image is, or a couple of images that first come to mind, I'm wondering if it was maybe an image like one of these. But I think today it's really important to really broaden the images that come into your mind, and maybe an image like this is really what we should be thinking of. Now, this is a woman using an electric breast pump, and this one I feel like is a little over the top. She's chatting on her phone with her friend. She's in this very nice living room. Looks like she's having a great time, and you know, it's maybe a little bit of an exaggerated kind of perspective, but I would argue that maybe this isn't too far off in terms of the changes we've seen in our society around milk expression or pumping. When I talk about pumping, I'm often thinking about use of an electric breast pump because that's become very popular, but manual pumps are still very common, and women also use their hands to express milk. So there's a variety of different ways to express milk. So just how popular has pumping become? Well, we actually have no real national data, nationally representative data, but we can kind of extrapolate from some older data or other smaller studies. And my best guesstimate is that it's likely over 93% of infants who are fed human milk are fed pump milk at least some of that time. And we know this, we're pretty confident this has increased substantially. For instance, in 1992, about 38% of infants in an Australian sample were fed pump milk. That number was 69% in 2003, and it's certainly higher in the US today. In terms of who pumps, really the epidemiology of pumping, again, we don't have solid national data to guide us here to fully understand, and it probably is, it appears to be shifting over time. But interestingly, some people seem to assume it's probably working moms, that is moms working outside the home, who are pumping because they're separated from their baby on a daily basis, and so they need to pump in order to provide milk for their baby routinely. But actually, data that we've collected and some others have suggests that women who are home with their baby, they're pumping too, and maybe almost as much. So it's not just employment outside the home that's a strong predictor. It's also quite likely that socioeconomic factors, kind of like the ones I mentioned earlier that produce disparities in our overall breastfeeding rates, are likely at play as well. So it's probably skews towards the higher SES women that are more likely to pump or pump for a longer duration. Although, like I said, these data are a little bit, could merit some more substantiation with some better national data. So what is the downstream effect of pumping? I'm going to touch on what some of the contemporary phenomenon we have observed, not in all communities and not for all moms, but some interesting phenomena that I think have really are new, things that have emerged really in the last 10 to 15 years. We know some moms make extra milk, lots and lots of it. Some make just some extra milk, enough to kind of get by and feed their baby here and there. But some women really are pumping a lot. And this photo is one I find just very fascinating in that, you know, all of those baggies are probably 5 ounce baggies of milk. And there's, you know, I don't even know, there's gotta be hundreds of them there. And, you know, I think you can go online actually and look for, if you Google breast milk stash or breast milk stockpile, you can find lots of photos like this of women showing off their breast milk stockpile, which probably is more than any baby could really possibly ever consume. And so, although this example might be a bit extreme, it's, I think, an example of what this means for moms in terms of what options they have when they do have extra milk. And really those options are basically, you know, they can dump it down the drain if their baby doesn't consume it. That's not, I don't think, a super popular option or one moms look forward to, because, you know, they feel, a lot of women feel a lot of attachment to their milk and feel like it's a very valuable substance. They wouldn't want to waste it. They could give it to a friend who maybe needs some extra milk for their baby, and I'll get a lot more into that issue in a little bit. They can donate it to a milk bank that can pasteurize the milk and give it to babies in neonatal intensive care units at hospitals, for instance. They could sell their milk either in their community or online. So these are all options one might have in a situation like this. Like I said, there's a lot of pictures you can find online of breast milk. These are some of my favorites I really like of breast milk stockpiles. I like this one on the left. There's just enough room for the Thanksgiving turkey there. And the one on the right is there's so much going on in this picture. At first glance, it may not seem like it, but those are 1 gallon jugs of milk. So from a food safety perspective, I'm a little troubled by this picture in that it's pretty clear that milk would have had to be sort of like layered and layered and layered and refrozen, one layer on top of another to get a full gallon of milk. And it's probably not a real safe way to collect and store milk. And then what do you do with a gallon of frozen milk? I mean, that would take a while for, you know, a little while for a baby to consume. And how do you thaw that safely in a way that is going to be used? So I wonder if that mom maybe has second thoughts now about what she's going to do. do with those containers of milk. But I think these are really interesting pictures of what's going on in some people's freezers anyway. So on the flip side, you know, where can this extra milk go? There certainly is a demand for milk out there from a variety of places. As I'm sure you've noticed since you work in public health, breastfeeding is heavily promoted by clinicians and public health organizations. And women having babies these days want to provide milk for their baby more than any generation in recent memory. Those messages have really sunk in for a lot of women, not all women, but a lot of women really have a strong interest in providing milk for their baby. But if you ask them, about 3/4 report that at one time or another, they feel like they have difficulty making enough milk. And so there certainly is demand on the personal level for more milk. Neonatal intensive care units in the US have, many of them now have donor milk programs where they obtain milk usually from milk banks, but sometimes from industry sources, and provide screened and pasteurized milk for babies in the NICU whose mothers are unavailable or too sick or can't produce enough milk for their needs. And there's some evidence that there are important health benefits for these babies of receiving human milk over infant formula during these early days of life. Some healthy newborn nurseries are now offering donor milk under varying criteria for why they might offer that to healthy moms and babies, but that is something that is going on in some hospitals. And those hospitals are getting milk from the milk banks as well. And so for those women who are feeling like they can't provide enough milk for their baby, you know, what really are their options? You know, obviously they can switch to formula, and some women just really aren't inclined to do so and like to avoid formula at all costs, or they can get milk from another mother. And so, you know, really the options are pretty limited if you're not able to make enough milk for your own baby. And that really puts some women feel like they don't have a lot of options and feel kind of in a corner. So where the supply of milk and where this demand for milk, where these meet in the middle, one can think of, I guess, as an economist might think of as a milk market. One angle of this market would be our nonprofit milk banks. And if you work in the area of maternal and child health, I encourage you to become familiar with the Human Milk Banking Association of North America. They're a network of nonprofit milk banks around the country that are set up to screen donors and accept donations of milk from women who have extra milk. The last estimate I could find is that they provide about 6 million ounces per year of milk, which is quite a bit. Most of their milk goes to neonatal intensive care units. That the milk banks are nonprofit, so they're just out to cover their costs. And usually they don't have extra milk available to the public, although some of them do sometimes. But it's not generally like the kind of thing where most people can just walk in off the street and buy milk for their baby. Their donors are not compensated, and like I said, the milk is pasteurized, and the donors are screened so that the milk is as safe as possible for the babies, like I said, who are mostly babies in NICUs. There's another component to milk markets, and that is a series of for-profit companies that you may or may not be familiar with unless you work in this space or have had someone with extra milk, or maybe you work in a NICU setting. Some of their logos are here, and you can obviously visit their websites and learn more, but they use a lot of high-tech procedures to also screen, pasteurize, and process the milk, usually making a milk product or a milk fortifier or milk concentrate to be added to milk in neonatal intensive care units. Those tend to be very expensive products that are usually outside the reach of most families, and only some NICUs offer them. But it's sort of really reflecting the high-tech nature of where we are these days with human milk. And sometimes, or it depends on the company or the organization and also the woman, but donors are often offered compensation for their milk. And this has been something that has been controversial at times, in that some people feel that women should be fairly compensated for their milk. I mean, it's something they worked hard to produce, and many of them are you don't have access to paid maternity leave, or, are in a troublesome financial situation. And so they should be fairly compensated for their work and for something that they're giving of themselves. And that's only fair. Whereas other people feel like that is sort of commodifies milk or objectifies women's bodies, or also raises all sorts of health equity issues. Since you're in Michigan, you may have heard of the story a few years ago where Medolac and the Clinton Foundation tried to partner with African-American women in Detroit to sell their milk to Medolac to make some of these products. And that was obviously seen with great controversy and raised all sorts of, resurrected all sorts of racist images from history around wet nursing and practices like that. So like I said, this has been an angle of controversy in this part of the marketplace. One other place where milk is exchanged hands is in peer-to-peer sharing online. So that's where women or families are exchanging milk online just amongst themselves outside of any sort of regulation or processing or formal screening. And this can be done for free, or it could be a situation where milk is being bought and sold. But we estimated at least 7 million ounces per year are probably available online. Certainly offline exchanges amongst family or friends or acquaintances in communities are certainly more common than online, but there aren't good estimates at all about that. These are some of the organizations involved in either the free sharing or the selling online, and you're certainly welcome to go visit their websites and learn more about what they're all about. I thought I would just show you one advertisement to give you a flavor for how these exchanges go online. Here's an ad I pulled. It's a new ad from Northville, Michigan, a woman looking to sell her milk for about $1.50 an ounce. And so she's saying how she advertises, she has a couple pictures of her baby. She advertises she's a young and healthy mom who pumps at least about 100 ounces per day and has more than enough to spare. She indicates she does not smoke, drink, or do drugs, and she maintains a healthy diet, and she's willing to sell fresh or frozen milk. And she's also willing to adjust her diet according to your needs. She's also willing to sell to men. And she's saying, part about her motivation is she'd like to help herself and her baby out while also helping out someone in need. So I think this is a good example of an ad that kind of thing that's posted online all the time, and people can reach out and connect to buy milk this way. You may wonder about the part about selling to men. You may or may not be familiar with that. I'm not going to really get into that today. If you're interested in learning more about that, though, there's a brand new Netflix series called Unwell, that just came out last month, and one of the episodes is about adults drinking breast milk for health or fitness reasons. And you could see our research is featured in that episode, and is a piece of entertaining TV if you want something to watch on Netflix some evening. Well, back in 2010, I and some of my collaborators really noticed just a lot more activity online around peer-to-peer milk sharing and selling. And the FDA also noticed and issued a statement that year indicating some concerns they had around the fact that this milk was really a body fluid that was being exchanged in an unregulated manner that they didn't currently have the capability to regulate, but wanted to talk more about that possibility at the time. And they expressed in a statement to the public that they had concerns around the exchange of milk because of the risk of infectious disease, the fact that babies could be exposed to illicit drugs or contraindicated pharmaceuticals that could be in the milk, the potential for environmental contaminants, either from occupational exposure or other high exposure environments, that one could add additives to the milk to boost the volume, and that there could be other possible risks to recipient babies, and they wanted to alert the public. But there was really very little research to know how real these risks were for infants, and there was concern that these risks could be potentially magnified for babies who are preterm and sick and potentially more vulnerable to these possible exposures. And so, seeing all of this going on, I and some of my collaborators decided we were going to go ahead and purchased samples anonymously online and analyzed the milk to see what we could find to try to get a handle on what was in the milk and what was really going on. So this was a series of actually about 5 sub-studies that I'm going to just sort of condense and touch on just very briefly here, but we basically tried to address as many of the potential risks that the FDA had highlighted. So we looked for the presence and amount of aerobic bacteria, including pathogenic bacteria that could be in the milk. We looked to see if HIV or a virus called cytomegalovirus was in the milk. We also looked for evidence of tobacco use in the form of the metabolite cotinine and a panel of 13 different illicit drugs that are the most commonly used in the US to see if we detected a presence of any of those. And one reason we looked for tobacco was not because we're especially concerned about infant exposure to tobacco through breast milk. I mean, we would counsel smoking mothers to breastfeed their babies, but again, if you're buying milk somewhere for your own baby, I don't think you want it containing high amounts of tobacco metabolites. And also we noticed that a huge proportion of women advertising their milk online would indicate they weren't smokers. They would say they were non-smokers. And so we were interested to see if they were being truthful about that. And then again, because of the concern about adulteration, we wanted to see if we could detect the presence of cow's milk or formula added to the milk. And in doing that, we were looking for mitochondrial DNA markers from both bovine origin and human origin in the milk to see if we could detect any adulteration with cow's milk. So these are just we took photos of all the milk when it arrived in our lab. That was really interesting to document how people were shipping the milk, the kind of condition it arrived in. And we got all sorts of situations from very solidly frozen milk to absolutely thawed and leaking milk. It was quite an experience to receive these packages and see what, this is a gallon-sized Ziploc bag up here in the upper right, which is an interesting container choice. In sum, after the series of studies we conducted, like I said, we had 102 samples, and we found that about 3/4 of them had aerobic bacterial counts of one sort or another, or the presence of pathogenic bacteria like coliform bacteria, to the extent that they would fail an established criterion to be fed to like a baby in a NICU. The milk banks have a criterion for feeding fresh milk if they ever needed to, unpasteurized milk, and about 3/4 of our samples would have failed that criterion to be safe for one of those babies. So we use that as a benchmark for that particular study. We didn't detect any HIV in the milk, thank goodness, although about 1/5 of the samples had cytomegalovirus present, and that's of uncertain consequence for a baby who might be exposed, who had not been exposed previously. We had a handful of samples that had really pretty high cotinine levels that were indicative of being an active smoker. And looking back at the advertisements those women posted, all of them, or I think all except one, had said they were a non-smoker in their advertisement. So we were concerned about the fact that they had very high levels of cotinine in their milk, which would suggest to the contrary. And then we found about 10% of our samples were topped off with a substantial amount of cow's milk. And so we consider that evidence of adulteration. And so taken in sum, we found these results to be pretty concerning. And if you're interested in reading more about these studies, here are some of the citations. I'm happy to send you some later. But, you know, you might wonder why I have a picture of Conan O'Brien here. You know, as an epidemiologist, like, I feel like sometimes we kind of toil in obscurity, and maybe the only people who see our work sometimes are our peers who read journal articles and things like that. And sometimes the media get a hold of our research, but it's usually, you know, a science writer or something who wants to feature something or criticize something about work we've done. And so I think we all need to be prepared for those situations as well. But when we published this series of studies, we were really surprised to see twice, actually, Conan O'Brien picked up on some of our work and decided to mention it in his opening monologue. And so I always like to watch this video, and I'll see if I can get it to work on the screen share. let's see, I'm sharing sound. Nicole, can you see this new screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, and I'm gonna push play. If you can't hear it, please speak up, okay?
Some families who have trouble nursing their babies have been actually purchasing breast milk on the internet. Did you hear about that? Yeah. And now a new study released by Nationwide Children's Hospital in Ohio claims that breast milk purchased online might not be safe to drink. You should not.
I just ordered 10 gallons of this.
I love the title of the milk. It's the stupidest thing I've ever seen.
I couldn't afford the brand
Why
name, so I got
are you chugging it
generic.
during my monologue?
I need a little energy.
All right.
I hope you all could see that and hear it okay.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Nicole. So it's just something fun, I think, that comes along in your career, you know, a surprise like that. It's always interesting to see who picks up on some little thread of evidence of some research you've done. So if that ever happens to you, I hope something like that happens to all of you too. It kind of makes it worthwhile sometimes. So I just want to give you a little flavor of the dynamic nature of what's going on with breastfeeding with all of that. Things are still rapidly changing, and really today, the question it raises in mine and others' minds is really, does the body of evidence that we've built over many decades about the benefits of breastfeeding, does it even really apply to today's women and infants anymore? You know, all of this existing evidence is based largely on studies where feeding at the breast was the norm, or feeding at the breast versus formula, really before pumping became popular. And just to summarize where I feel like our best evidence is from those studies for causality would be in things like infant mortality. You know, internationally, breastfeeding is very, very important for preventing infant mortality in developing world settings in particular. Procedural pain management, breast milk or breastfeeding has been shown to be effective at reducing pain from procedures in hospital settings for infants. It appears that breastfeeding does protect against eczema. It reduces the risk of necrotizing enterocolitis, again, another condition that affects preterm neonates, and it can be fatal. And breastfeeding probably does give some boost to some aspects of intelligence. But again, is this evidence really even generalizable to infants fed pump milk? Is feeding pump milk as good as feeding at the breast? I think this is a question a lot of families have, and clinicians should be asking too if they aren't already. And I think some clinicians are being asked this question and they don't know the answer. And then what does this even mean about feeding infants another mother's milk? You know, there's quite a bit of research going on comparing mother's own milk to donor milk in the NICU setting, but outside of there, we really don't have a good feel for what, you know, how this older evidence translates to these new contemporary settings for infant feeding. And so when we're giving women advice or families advice about infant feeding, you know, what evidence is that based on, and what are we really recommending? And I think this is really a burning question we have right now in public health that really needs to be addressed. Not to mention this new way of feeding infants with the pumping and maybe even sharing milk leads to a lot of measurement challenges in our studies. So traditionally, infant feeding practices are measured by some sort of maternal report, where we either ask women to recall over some period of time, either a short period of time or it can be many decades even, about how they fed their infant. Or if we have the resources to and the time, we can use prospective measures like diaries, where we ask people over and over again about how they're feeding their baby until something changes or they stop feeding, or until the end of some follow-up period. Today, we can use text messages or apps for recording this. We end up with a lot of detailed data that sometimes we're not even sure what to do with, but it's in a more prospective nature and avoids some of the pitfalls we can get with recall. And we're still using some pretty old questions that I think are missing some of the detail that we really need these days. So in terms of the more popular questionnaires out there, for instance, this is the question that's generally used in NHANES, the National Immunization Survey, the National Survey of Children's Health. A lot of the federal surveys use basically the same question, which was the child ever breastfed or fed breast milk? And, so you can see the problem with this question is that it doesn't distinguish feeding at the breast versus express milk feeding, and maybe you're interested in measuring both. It assumes the mother and infant are providing and consuming milk simultaneously when, you could tell by looking at the freezers we looked at earlier, that's not always the case. Some women stop lactating, but their child goes on to continue consuming milk, maybe for quite a few months after that. And so when we're just asking about the child, we're really not getting a good sense of the mother's lactation experience. And sometimes for maternal outcomes, that's really what's more salient anyway. And these questions don't distinguish mother's own milk from another mother. And we don't even know if the respondent is thinking about milk they may have gotten from someone else when they answer this question. So it really raises the question of, whether we're getting good estimates, even from our national surveys about infant feeding, what we might want to call breastfeeding, whatever that is, are we getting good data anymore? And we set out to provide some insight into that question through a grant we received from the National Center for Health Statistics a few years back, wanting to provide some improved questions for a retrospective assessment, one-time retrospective assessment of infant feeding. So we published what we call the Baby Mirrors, which is the brief breastfeeding and milk expression recall survey that attempted to distinguish both the mode of feeding, so bottle versus breast, and the substance being fed, so human milk and formula, and try to distinguish the mother's lactation practices from the infant's feeding experiences. It's longer than the couple of questions typically used in the federal surveys. It's, I think, about 9 questions long. But we administered the Baby Mirrors questions alongside the federal survey questions to 225 mothers in a random order. The 2 modules were randomized and looked at differences in terms of the estimates that were generated by the responses to those questions. And you can read more detail about the results in that particular paper below, but in a nutshell, we found that when moms and babies weren't doing the same thing at the same time, the federal questions generated lower estimates of total human milk feeding duration. And so that suggests us our federal statistics maybe for duration, maybe slight underestimates. And respondents who answered the federal survey questions first were more than 3 times more likely to provide discrepant responses, so that we think the longer set of questions help moms think through in a little more detail about their experiences and perhaps give a more accurate answer. Other measurement challenges that come up in this area now, again, distinguishing the mode and the substance fed seems to be a critical piece, and a handful of studies have picked up on this and actually estimated the differences. So in a nutshell, the following studies looked at what happens when you have more pumped milk feeding and less feeding at the breast. What does that do to the risk of various health outcomes for babies? So one study reported more wheeze and coughing in infancy with more pumped milk feeding and less feeding at the breast. Another study found a higher risk of asthma, another poorer memory skills. We found those babies had more ear infections, and recently at age 6 had poorer working memory, which is an aspect of cognitive ability. We've looked at some other outcomes like obesity, growth, asthma, inhibitory control, which is another aspect of development and behavior, and also risk of diarrhea in infancy, and did not see any associations there with pump milk feeding. But I think this is very much still an open question, an area and much more in need of research. Of course, these questions, just like in our usual breastfeeding research, are subject to lots of problems or challenges with dealing with confounding factors around why people feed their babies the way they do, and also the potential for some reverse causation, which I'll touch on in a little bit later when I get back to talking about evidence for causality with the benefits of breastfeeding. Other challenges today with measurement include the fact that the mode of feeding and the substance being fed can change temporarily. It can change permanently. The fact that it's become really common these days for babies to be fed really from very early after birth all of the above. So bottle, human milk from a bottle, formula from a bottle, and feeding at the breast, some combination of all of these in a very dynamic day-to-day shifting balance that is very difficult to measure accurately in just a couple of questions in a retrospective fashion. So there still is a need for more detailed measures to try to capture this richness and this variation over time, and I think it's becoming a greater and greater challenge. So again, because this is an epidemiology audience and this is a presentation about breastfeeding, I feel like I definitely need to touch on the challenge for causality that absolutely plagues this field. It is very, very difficult to establish strong evidence for causality with breastfeeding for a number of reasons. One is confounding. It is very difficult to really control for a whole host of confounding factors, some of which we measure okay or try to measure fairly well, some of which are just almost unmeasurable or not things that are really hard to put your finger on exactly in terms of a subtle aspect of lifestyle or behavior or approach to feeding or mental health that is really rather subtle. And so those things are very hard to measure and to control for. Now, of course, randomized trials could address confounding, but most randomized designs would be unethical. And this has been something that's been really challenging in the breastfeeding world, in that we really can't randomize one group of infants to be breastfed and the other group of infants to be formula fed. There have been some creative designs certainly to try to get around that, but they answer a slightly different question. But as a body of evidence, I think we're getting greater and greater insight into what may be causal associations by doing using really creative trial designs to try to build a body of evidence around this question. One reason we know that our conventional control for confounders in our observational studies is inadequate is if you line up the results we see from observational studies, for instance, the association between breastfeeding and neurodevelopment, their observational studies will say time and time again, there's a modest, moderate association where longer or more exclusive breastfeeding is associated with improved neurodevelopment. But lining that up versus results from trials, we don't see those associations. And I point your attention to the PROBIT trial, which is now getting to be almost a historic trial done in the 90s in Belarus, but where they randomized at the hospital level hospitals of births to a program of promotion of prolonged and exclusive breastfeeding versus standard of care in a setting where breastfeeding rates were quite low. And so they're able to, in sort of an indirect way, look at the impact, the causal impact of prolonged and exclusive breastfeeding on a whole variety of outcomes over the long term. And we can see when we line up their results with the results from lots and lots of observational studies, we see that there are big differences in terms of the results related to growth, obesity, asthma, neurodevelopment. And so I think it's really just one more example of how challenging it is to do observational research in this area. And now with the measurement challenges with today's feeding practices, I think those challenges are even more magnified. One other complication with infant feeding that makes establishing causality really difficult is that the feeding experience in one time period can affect feeding in a subsequent time period. So the exposure is changing based on an interim sense of the outcome. And Michael Kramer's group with PROBIT wrote a series of papers that really elegantly looked at this from a variety of different angles over the past 15 years or so. For instance, if you look at observational studies, they pretty consistently point to the idea that breastfed babies appear to grow slower and have a lower risk of obesity in childhood than formula-fed babies. The observational studies will suggest that. Of course, we do have those strong confounding issues I mentioned earlier that are a problem. And when you look at the results from the PROBIT trial and their randomized design, you don't see these same associations that you see in the observational studies because they are able to deal with these confounding factors more effectively. But the other thing you see is this idea of reverse causation, where if you take, for instance, let's say you have a young baby that's a rapidly growing baby that's hungry all the time. So they're crying more than other babies because they're hungry. So mom's breastfeeding that baby and from birth and perceives that maybe her milk supply is inadequate based on her perception of how the baby's growing. And so she feeds more formula, less milk, and in the end has a bigger baby, and it makes it look like the formula led to that there being a bigger baby. When you take the contrasting situation where, let's say you have a slower growing baby that doesn't fuss as much, mom perceives her milk supply is adequate, so she keeps breastfeeding and ends up with a smaller baby. And so you have this interesting cycle where, more complicated example than we usually see of reverse causation. You see it happening over time and sort of the spiraling effect where you end up seeing an outcome that in observational studies that maybe isn't really truly the case. And like I said, if you want to read more about this, Kramer's group has written a series of elegant papers and commentaries about it to learn more. Another, I think, decent example of this idea of reverse causation is an emerging literature about breastfeeding and autism. So I think autism researchers would generally agree that autism is a condition with a strong prenatal foundation. Yet there are quite a few observational studies now, and I noted a meta-analysis was just published showing a reduced risk of autism with longer or more exclusive breastfeeding in a variety of different samples. And I think, again, this is another example of where this could be a situation of reverse causation. We also know from the autism literature that even infants who will go on to develop autism have subtle or sometimes not so subtle behaviors in infancy that experts might pick up on, or if the infant were evaluated, they might be detectable. Parents may or may not pick up on them, but those could be the kinds of things that maybe make it more difficult to breastfeed. Maybe the baby's a little bit less settled or has more sensitivity issues when feeding at the breast. And so those might be kind of subtle feedback mechanisms that moms might pick up on, maybe make feeding a little more difficult, and that baby goes on to maybe breastfeed for a shorter duration than they might have if they weren't destined to go on and be diagnosed with autism. And so I think we do potentially have that issue here with breastfeeding and autism that Kramer reported with breastfeeding and growth and obesity. So I think this is a really interesting feature of the breastfeeding literature. And again, another challenge that I don't think we have great solutions for given our inability to do the kinds of randomized trials that we'd really love to be able to do. And so I hope I've given you a flavor today, just sort of a high level overview of what I see as the current picture around breastfeeding research in the US. You know, breastfeeding is an exposure that affects pretty much all humans that walk the globe, maybe in different ways or in different contexts for sure. But it's also something that's obviously very dynamic, has a lot of global variation. I focus very much on the US context today, but there's a lot of interesting change going on worldwide around infant feeding. And I think it's a really interesting field of research and a lot of major problems that we need a lot of smart people to come help address in this field of research. So I hope some of you might be interested in at least adding some breastfeeding measures to your study, or if you're already working in this area, I'm happy to chat more about it. I think it's a really fun area of research and can be really impactful because, like I said, it's something that really touches on all women, infants, and really families in general. I want to acknowledge my collaborators, Sheila Garrity at Cincinnati Children's, Rena Oza-Frank at the Ohio Department of Health, Jesse Quick and Joe Hogan at Ohio State, and Lynette Rogers and Mark Klebanoff at Nationwide Children's, and the variety of funders we've worked with over the years to compile the body of research that we have to date. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with them and others to continue to generate results that I hope will help public health and clinicians make good decisions around infant feeding. I'm happy to have a discussion or answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. And now I'd like to open it up to the group for questions. Feel free to use the chat box or just jump in.
Hi, Sarah, this is Jean. Thank you so much. Wow, wow, wow. What a lot of stuff you covered. And you're so famous. Netflix, Conan, all the science and extra too. I think you use such clever research questions, clever design, and I want to ask you two things. One I just want to mention to you. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but because of your presentation previously on pumping and pumping questions, we added those questions to our probability-based cohort in Michigan, which is part of the ECHO program, and also adding those to another big pregnancy cohort being started at Henry Ford Health System. So I just wanted you to know that your influence is already going far and wide. And we should have some preliminary results of our Michigan-based cohort pumping sort of prevalence questions soon. So I will share those with you right away and see if you have any insight. And we do have a little group of researchers that's growing to think about some of these issues. So if it's all right with you, we would like to consult with you on those. And the question I have is if you have any remaining breast milk from that sort of study where you purchase the breast milk, because as I also mentioned earlier, I'm very interested in looking at the nutrient content of breast milk, and we are not collecting breast milk samples in our ECHO cohort. We will collect them in the other cohort that's just not even begun yet, though. And so I just wondered if you had any breast milk left, and if you would be interested in that kind of work. And if you didn't, if you suggest that as a way to go, or what kind of IRB issues did you have in coming up with that? Anyway, sorry for so many questions. I'll go back on mute, but I'm just so excited. Your work is very cool.
Oh, thanks, Jean. And it looks like you're having a wonderful walk out in the woods. Yeah, I'm jealous. That looks so fun. Well, I'm so flattered that you're using some of our questions. I'd love to hear about your experience and how that's going. And I'm happy to help in any way I can as you move forward with those projects. That's fantastic. And I think even if you were to publish simply on the prevalence of pumping practices in your sample, that would make an important contribution to the literature. We're in dire need of any estimates about what women are doing, and really anywhere in the US. We're way behind, I think, in measuring this at a national level. And I'm happy to connect with your group about pumping. And I still have all of the leftover milk that we bought on the internet, and it's old. I mean, that's the downside, is it's not very fresh anymore. We bought it in 2013, I think, and it's in all sorts of crazy containers, and some of it's been freeze thawed a time or two, but I'm happy to think with you of ways we can use it, because I haven't come up with a lot of good ideas, because again, it's from such an unusual source, and it's a little bit old now, but happy to talk more about that, Jean. That would be great.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Hey, Sarah, I had a question. This is Claudia. Has there been any relationship observed between moms pumping and breast health, like mastitis or, problems with excessive chapping and things like that?
There certainly are a lot of, I guess I'll just call them kind of lactation complications that can arise with pumping as well as feeding at the breast, and some that are unique to pumping. So there are actually women who've been injured by pumps. A pump is still, can be a powerful device and has lots of little parts, and some women have actually had injuries. There are also women who have, the parts need to fit properly, and I think those could certainly contribute to problems or even more minor symptoms one might have, in addition to just being less effective as a device to extract milk. So I think there are a lot of different possibilities there. And actually, Gail and I were talking earlier about just a need for better quality education for women in using pumps, because there aren't a lot of opportunities for timely and quality education around pump use, I think, in our country. And I think that's something women are really looking for. And so, they're left to kind of just rely on Pinterest and Instagram or something, YouTube, for pumping advice. And I'm not sure that's where we want people to be the first place that they go. So I think we definitely have room for improvement in how we're using breast pumps.
I have a question, Sarah. I was really struck by the prevalence of CMV in the donor milk. Is that like active CMV infection, or is it like did you use like an IgG type indication of past infection for that estimate?
It was, I believe it was detectable. It was detectable virus, but it wasn't necessarily live infectious virus, if that makes sense. So, and we would expect most of its milk had been frozen for who knows how long in women's freezers before they sent it to us. So we would expect the milk freezing to reduce the amount of possible infectious CMV in milk. But so we were just basically looking for the presence of CMV. You know, CMV is a funny thing. It's one of those viruses that a lot of us carry around and we don't get sick and it's no big deal. And the epidemiology of CMV in the population is a little all over the place. I mean, it's not something that clusters really strongly in certain subpopulations or with certain health behaviors, but it was just interesting. We did see a little bit more of it in the milk we bought online. We're not really sure how to interpret that. And for most babies, it's probably no big deal. But again, for a baby in a NICU setting to be exposed potentially to CMV, maybe from milk from someone else when their mom was CMV negative, it wasn't something they were exposed to in utero or through their mom's milk. The potential consequence for illness is there. And as you know, the neurodevelopmental consequences of CMV infection in neonates can be significant. So that is why we focused on CMV. Any other questions?
Doing a quick scan of our virtual room. Let's see. Got to click across 2 pages because that's how many people are still online.
You have such a large audience. I'm so glad that you all stuck around and were interested in attending today.
Well, thank you so much, for joining us today, for telling us more about your work, and it's been a great visit, even if it was virtual.
Next time we'll do it in person, for sure.
That's right.
I'd love to come see all of you in person. I think you're doing wonderful things there at Michigan State, wonderful research and training, and your students are fantastic. So I'd love to come visit in person and meet you all again.
Same. Thanks so much again. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you soon, either in person or in a Zoom call.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.